Now let's take a look at high lunge position, which is also referred to as crescent lunge or in Sanskrit, Ashta Chandrasana. Now let's go over all of the benefits you get whenever you practice high lunge position. And there really are quite a few benefits, starting with the most important benefit, which is strengthening the legs. In fact, you really are strengthening all parts of the legs. The quads are active. You're also strengthening and lengthening the hamstring muscles. Your calf muscles are activated, and you're creating stability in the ankle joints, especially with your back foot, as you have that back heel lifted and press the heel back. And so all of the parts of your legs and your feet, specifically your ankles, are being toned and activated and also strengthened whenever you are in a lunge position. Now, another area you're strengthening and creating mobility within are the hips. And so the hips are a main area that we're targeting whenever we're in a high lunge position, but in order to get that benefit, we have to square the hips to the front and also keep the hips level to one another. When we do that, we are strengthening the hip joints as well as the hip flexors and creating more stability within the hips by fine-tuning the more subtle muscles like the psoas muscles that extend through the hips. And hip stability and strength is one of the main benefits that we get whenever we are in our high lunge position. And when we apply that action of pushing the front foot forward and pushing the ball of the back foot backwards, then we really activate through the pelvic area and we create more stability in the hips and groin. All right, now another area we're strengthening is the core. The action of pulling the belly in and up helps create not only a strong core, but a protected spine. So core strengthening is another thing that's happening and another benefit of high lunge. Now the last area of the body we're strengthening is the arms and shoulders. The action of extending the elbows and bringing the biceps beside the ears not only helps activate the arm muscles, but also the shoulder muscles. It also takes quite a bit of flexibility to draw the biceps beside the ears, which is creating flexibility and strength in the shoulders at the same time. And so all of those parts of your body are being strengthened. Now we're also stretching certain areas of our body. And if we think of a lunge position where the leg that is back towards the back of the mat, not only are we strengthening that back leg, but we're also getting a nice stretch down the hamstring and into the calf muscle. So we're strengthening the legs and also stretching the legs. As we press the back heel further back, that really helps deepen the stretch down the calf muscle and into the ankle joint. The action of squaring the hips, as mentioned to you a moment ago, not only strengthens the hips, but also creates more mobility within the hip joints. And so you're strengthening the legs and you're stretching the legs all at the same time. And so those are the main benefits of a crescent lunge position. Now let's take a look at the most common misalignments you'll see in high lunge position. And we'll start with the misalignments of the front leg. And so the two most common things you'll see are that when students are in a high lunge position, the front foot is too close to the center of the mat and you lose that distance, which is meant to be feet as wide as hips whenever you're in crescent lunge. And so when this happens, it's really difficult for your students to then square the hips to the front of the mat without compensating somewhere else. And so in order to square the hips to the front of the mat, the feet have to be as wide as the hips. Okay, and so if you see that happening where the front foot is too close to center, make sure you readjust your students and have them walk or inch that front foot out a little until the feet are as wide as the hips. Now, the second thing you're going to notice is that often that front knee starts to buckle inwards towards the center of the mat. Okay, and this puts the knee at risk of injury. And so we really want to make sure that that front knee tracks right above the front ankle. In fact, if you see this happening, always correct this misalignment right away, because it really does put the body in danger, especially that front knee. It's compromised. All right, and so if you're noticing the knee buckle inwards, remind your students to position the front knee directly above the front ankle. All right, and so look out for those two misalignments because they are the most common misalignments you'll see in crescent lunge. Now let's take a look at common misalignments for the back leg in crescent lunge. And so two things you'll notice often is that when someone is in a crescent lunge position, they have a bend in that back knee. Okay? Now, it's not always possible for students to fully straighten the back leg in a lunge position. Perhaps their hips are too tight to find that movement. And so if you notice a bend in the back knee, encourage your students to try to straighten that back leg as much as they can. All right, now another thing to look for is that that front heel doesn't start to fall towards the mat. In fact, you want to press the back heel towards the floor without letting it buckle towards the mat. So you don't want to pivot the heel down like you do in Warrior 1 or Warrior 2. The back heel is lifted here. And so really, you're balancing on the ball of your back foot. Okay, so if you see that happening where the knee is bent or the heel is falling down towards the mat, correct your students, have them straighten the back leg and really press the back heel towards the wall that is behind you. Now let's take a look at common misalignments in the hips whenever students are in crescent lunge. Before we get into these misalignments, one thing that's important to note is that always address misalignments in the position of the legs first. Because if you position the feet as wide as the hips, often that will correct the alignment of the hips. Not always, you still want to check in with the alignment of the hips once you've placed the feet properly, but always start with the placement of the feet first. Okay, now let's look at the misalignments you'll find in the hips. So depending on whatever foot's forward, in this case, I'll start with my left foot forward and my right foot back. So seeing as my left foot's forward, it's always the opposite hip that tends to pull back. So in this case, my right hip. Correct that first. If you see the right hip pulling back behind the left hip, then remind your students to draw the right hip forward and pull the left hip back until they've corrected that misalignment. Now, in the contrary, if my right foot's forward and my left foot is back, it's always the opposite hip. So in this case, now my left hip is behind my right hip because my right foot is forward. And so remind students to draw the left hip forward, pull the right hip back until the hips are facing forward. Let's take a look at what happens when one hip's higher than the other. And so as I step my left foot forward and my right foot back, it tends to be the opposite hip that drops lower. Okay, so in this case, it's my right hip because my left foot is forward. So if that right hip is lower, remind students to lift the right hip up until both hips are level. Okay, on the contrary, if my right foot's forward and my left foot's back, remember it's always the opposite hip. So in this case, my left hip is lower than my right. And so have students lift that left hip until both hips are at equal distance from the mat. Okay, and so those are the most common misalignments for the hips. And another thing that's important is once those hips are aligned, always try to have that tailbone stacked under the crown of the head. So you can even find a slight tuck to the tailbone in crescent lunge if needed, in case the tailbone's popping back, depending on your student's position. Think of bringing a slight tuck to that tailbone so that tailbone sits directly below the crown of the head. And then once you've addressed the misalignments in the hips and the tailbone, then the pelvis should be perfectly level, which is what you want whenever you are in a high lunge position. Now let's look at the most common misalignment for the spine that you're going to find in your students whenever they're in crescent lunge. And so the most typical position you'll see is that students are leaning forward with their torso and they lose that straight line from crown of head to tailbone. So if you see this happening, where students are leaning forward, just give them a really simple cue to lean back until their chest is directly above their hips. Okay, once you've corrected that, then you can have students ensure that the core is engaged to support that length in the spine. So remind students to activate their core or give them the cue, pull the belly in and up as you corset the ribs towards the spine, just to ensure that not only the spine stays straight, but also the spine stays protected by making sure the core is activated. All right, and so those are really important pieces of alignment in crescent lunge because it's so common for students to lean forward whenever they're in the lunge position. All right, and so watch out for that misalignment and have students lean back. Now, unlike a low lunge position where we encourage students to come into hyperextension with the spine, I often teach crescent lunge with a nice straight spine. I don't encourage students to lean back, because when that back knee is lifted, it puts a lot of pressure into the lower back. So avoid having students hyperextend in their high lunge. You can absolutely encourage hyperextension in a low lunge, but aim for a straight spine whenever students are in high lunge position. All right, and if they're leaning forward, have them lean back until that spine is in one straight line. Now let's focus on misalignments in the arms, shoulders, and neck whenever students are in their crescent lunge. And so start by addressing the arms, because if you first have students relax their shoulders and then straighten their arms, often their shoulders will lift again. All right, and so first just check that students have straight arms, biceps beside ears, and all 10 fingers spread nice and wide. Now the palms should also mirror one another. So palms are parallel to one another. Palms are not facing outwards. Palms are facing inwards towards one another. You also want to make sure that the arms are parallel to one another. So the inner elbows mirror one another and the biceps mirror one another. Once you've corrected the arms and making sure that students are not bending the elbows, elbows are straight, then correct the misalignment in the shoulders, because often here shoulders lift towards the ears. And so give the cue, relax the shoulders away from the ears, and that will help students correct the misalignment of the arms and the shoulders. Now, if you're noticing that the chin is tucked, this is the most common misalignment for the neck whenever students are in crescent lunge. And so give them the cue to lift their chin slightly away from their chest so that the neck is in neutral position, because often you'll notice that the neck is in flexion. All right, and so correct that, have students lift through the chin just so that the neck remains nice and long as well. And so those are the most common misalignments in the arms, making sure that elbows are not bent, making sure that the fingers are also not relaxed and bent, really spreading through the fingers, straightening through the elbows, relaxing the shoulders if they're lifted, and making sure the neck stays nice and long in case the chin is tucked. Watch out for those misalignments and make sure that you correct them. The alignment for your high lunge is very similar to a low lunge. Of course, there's subtle differences, but you'll notice that there's a lot of the same alignment points. Okay, starting with the position of the legs. And so when we're in a high lunge position, of course, we want to do this on both sides. And so I'll start with my left foot forward and my right foot back. Now, the most important thing to establish a strong foundation in your high lunge is to make sure that the feet are as wide as the hips. Okay, and so that might mean inching that left foot a little bit wider to the left in some instances, just so that both of the feet are as wide as the hips. This will create a really strong foundation, because if that front foot is too close to the middle of the mat, you'll notice students lose stability. And so once the feet are as wide as the hips, another important piece of alignment is making sure that that front knee tracks right above the front ankle. All right, and so that shin bone is essentially perpendicular to the floor. And once you have the knee above the ankle, you can play around with the distance of the front foot to the back foot. And so you might come more forward with that front foot to lunge deeper, or to lessen the lunge, you'll take that front foot back a little. Okay, and so you can play around with that distance. However, always make sure that the front knee is directly above the front ankle. Okay, once you have that alignment, another important piece of alignment is making sure that the four corners of that front foot are rooted in the mat evenly. You want to lift and spread the toes just to prevent the toes from bunching up, so the toes are in a relaxed position. Now, another important piece of alignment is making sure that you're balancing on the ball of your back foot. So essentially that back heel is lifted. Once you have the back heel lifted, you want to try to extend and straighten the back leg. However, as you're straightening the back leg, the most important piece of alignment is making sure the hips stay squared to the front of the mat, just like your low lunge position. always, always, always make sure that the hips are squared to the front of the mat or the front of the room. And once the hips are squared, you also want to make sure they're level so that one hip isn't higher than the other. Both hips are at equal distance from the floor. Once the hips are squared to the front of the mat, pull the belly in and up as you course hit the ribs towards the spine so you're strong through the core. Arms extend overhead and biceps come right beside the ears. Now you want to try to extend and straighten through the arms as you spread through all 10 fingers, but as you straighten the arms, make sure that the shoulders don't lift towards the ears. Try to keep the shoulders relaxed away from the ears, almost as if the shoulders are drawing down the back. From here, gaze comes forward, so you're looking at one point directly in front of you, and you want to make sure that the spine is nice and long, so chin is not tucked, chin is not lifted, chin is in a neutral position. You have one straight line from the crown of your head down to the tailbone, so spine is in extension. You have a nice long and straight spine. Once you have all of these important pieces of alignment in place, then you are in the proper alignment for Crescent Lunge. Now let's take a look at the physical adjustments you can offer in a high lunge position. And so Alex is going to come into high lunge, and the first adjustment is for the back heel. In some cases, while students are in this stretch, the back heel can start to fall towards the mat. And so you can simply grab hold of the foot by placing your hands to either side of the foot, and just very, very gently, I'm going to guide the heel back towards center so that the heel now disappears behind the front of the foot. Now, another adjustment we can offer for the back leg is when the back knee is bent. And so I'm going to place one hand to the front of the thigh and the opposite hand to the calf muscle before pressing the thigh towards the ceiling, which is going to take the bend out of the back knee. Okay, now the next adjustment is for the hips, and so it's always the hip of the back leg that tends to draw back. And so we want the hips squared to the front of the room. And so I want to place my hands to the sides of the hip, and seeing as Alex's right hip is slightly back, I'm going to use my right hand to draw the right hip forward as I use my left hand to pull Alex's left hip back. All right, now another adjustment we can offer is for the front knee. If the front knee is starting to cave inwards in a high lunge position, just simply grab hold of the knee with both hands and very, very gently guide the knee back to center so that the knee is positioned right on top of the ankle. Now, another adjustment we can offer is an adjustment to relax the shoulders. And so if the shoulders are lifting towards the ceiling, simply place the hands to the tops of the shoulders and help draw the shoulders down the back away from the ears. Now, the last adjustment we can offer here is the adjustment to press the arms back. And so place one hand between the shoulder blades, grab hold of the tops of the arms with the opposite hands, and just very, very gently start to press the arms towards the back of the room to facilitate an even deeper stretch in the shoulders. Okay, and so you can go ahead and release your high lunge. And so these are physical adjustments we can offer for a high lunge position to help students correct any misalignments. Let's focus now on variations and modifications for Crescent Lunge. And we'll start with the two most important ways to modify Crescent Lunge to make it easier and more accessible to your students. So there's two ways to modify Crescent Lunge, to simplify it and to reduce the challenge. Number one is walking that front foot a little bit closer towards you. As long as the knee stays above the ankle, as soon as you slide that front foot towards you, you lessen the lunge. So you're reducing the amount of effort needed in especially the front leg, as well as the back leg, in order to sustain the lunge. Now, another way you can modify lunge, in case you want to keep that front foot more forward and challenge yourself, you can then modify this lunge position in case you need a break by lowering the back knee to the mat and essentially coming into a low lunge position. And so this is a great way to still have students work with walking that front foot more forward. So they're finding that challenge, they're pushing their boundaries, but then if they need a break for a moment, they can just simply lower to the back knee and come into a low lunge position, and then perhaps even come back into high lunge position to challenge themselves again, but they have that option to take a break by coming into low lunge whenever they need to. So those are the most simple ways of modifying your high lunge position to make it more accessible. Now let's go over a variation of high lunge where you add a twist which brings rotation into the spine. And this is a really important variation because you'll teach it often. And that is because students crave this twist. It's a really nice stretch for the entire spine. And it almost feels as if you're wringing out any stress and tension that you're carrying pretty much anywhere throughout your spine. And so this rotation is meant to be done on both sides, and there's a couple ways that you can come into it. Now let's start with rotation to the right. And so when I have my right foot forward, that's when I would also rotate to the right. You want to have your regular foundation for high lunge where your feet are as wide as your hips. This is going to keep you stable when you're twisting. And you also want to try to ensure that the hips stay squared to the front of the mat as you're twisting. Okay, now you can come into this a couple ways. What I like to do is have students place their right hand on their right hip first as they extend the left arm up towards the ceiling. Now from here, have your students lean forward as they try to keep the spine as long as possible. Okay, so essentially you're avoiding rounding the back, you're avoiding flexing the spine. You want to try to create a long spine here. Now, once the spine is nice and long, then have students place the left elbow to the outside of the right knee before joining the palms together. All right, now I'm going to use this elbow. So my left elbow pushes into my right knee. At the same time, I'm pushing my knee back into the elbow. And that action allows me to twist and rotate towards the right with my torso. Okay, now another thing you want to try to do here is pull the right hip back as you draw the left hip forward. That's going to keep the hips squared to each other. So this right hip pulls back, left hip pulls forward as I'm twisting and rotating. Okay, you can also have students modify by placing the back knee down whenever they need to and continue the rotation from here. Now, if I were to do this on the opposite side, so my left foot's forward and my right foot's back, remember it's important to have feet as wide as hips and hips squared to the front. Now on this side, my left hand comes to my left hip, my right arm reaches up, same thing, I lean forward keeping length in the spine, and then right arm places to the outside of left knee, palms joined together in prayer position, and as I push my right elbow into my left knee, I'm pushing my knee back into the elbow and then rotating to the left. Now, another important thing to remember here is the importance of cueing breath. And so as you're twisting, have students lengthen the spine on the inhalation, and as they exhale, twist deeper on the exhale. So exhale always brings you deeper into the stretch, no matter what posture you are performing. Now let's go over another way you can walk students into the twisted version of high lunge. And so when you have them in their foundation of feet as wide as hips, another thing you can have them do is come to prayer position from here. So palms together, thumbs press into the sternum. As you inhale, lean forward. And as you exhale, left elbow to the outside of the right knee to help you to twist. Same thing on the opposite side. Once you're in your high lunge position, palms come together at prayer, squaring the hips to the front, lean forward, keeping length in the spine, and twist to the left. The last important thing to remember here is keeping the core engaged. It's so important to continue hugging belly to spine, making sure the core is strong. You need a strong core to protect the spine as you're rotating and twisting. You also want to encourage students to listen to their body whenever they're twisting. Sometimes students will over twist and push too hard, and then you risk injury. So give the reminder to listen to your body and to try not to go too far into the twist. These are all important things when you're twisting. Now let's cover the last important thing to remember. So as you're twisting, so in this case I'm twisting to my right, I want to think of drawing this right shoulder blade towards the spine as I'm twisting. Okay, don't let that shoulder lift or fall. Pull the shoulder up towards the ceiling as you're twisting, and that will help you twist further. And so on the opposite side, as I'm twisting to the left, I'm now pulling my left shoulder blade towards my spine, which is going to help me rotate further. And all of these things are so important to apply whenever you're adding rotation or twisting in a variation of high lunge. Now let me show you one of my favorite variations of a high lunge position. And this variation still incorporates twisting and rotation of the spine. However, the placement of your arms makes rotation a little bit more accessible. Okay, and so you want to teach this on both sides. In this case, I'll start with my right foot forward and my left foot back. Now, it's often nice to either have students come down into a low lunge first before then coming back into high lunge position with the legs. But when you come down onto the left knee, it makes finding this position a little bit more accessible, which is placing the left palm down and making sure that the left wrist is right in line with the left shoulder. All right, you'll also notice that my hand is pretty much in line with my left hip and my right ankle is pretty much in line with my right hip. So I have hips distance between my palm that's grounded and my foot that is forward. Now, once I have this position, then I can come back into that high lunge with my back leg by lifting my left knee and pressing my left heel back. Now, as I press my left heel back, I'm going to reach and extend my right arm towards the ceiling. And this is where I'll start rotating through my spine by lifting my chest up and pulling that right arm towards the ceiling. At the same time, I'm rotating my chest towards the right side of the room. Okay, on the contrary, if I'm coming into this position on the opposite side, so that my left foot is forward and my right foot is back, I can either have students transition into that position by placing the right palm down and reaching the left arm up, or what I like to do is first come down onto the right knee so that the right knee is grounded and I have less distance to reach with that right hand down. Okay, now once the right hand comes down, I want to make sure that I have hips distance between my front foot and my grounded palm. I'm also aligning this right wrist so that it's directly underneath the shoulder joint. You also want to try to spread all 10 fingers so that you're not pushing down all of that weight into the wrist. The more you spread your fingers, now you're going to take some of that weight and distribute it evenly through all 5 of those fingers. Another option here is to tent the fingers so that you can stay on the fingertips, but I like to press that palm down so it's firm in the mat and I have a strong foundation. Now, once I have this placement with my front foot and my front hand, I'm going to come into high lunge with my back leg, so lifting the right knee up, pushing that right heel back, and then from here, the left arm reaches towards the ceiling. Now, whichever arm's lifted, notice how my wrist joint is stacked right above my shoulder joint. So I want to try to find a straight line there from left wrist to left shoulder. I'm spreading my left fingers nice and wide. Notice how my chin is lifted. So you want to keep that chin lifted towards the top shoulder whenever you're twisting. I'm pushing down through that right palm. As I'm pulling that left arm up, I'm going to think of lifting my left chest towards the ceiling as I rotate my chest towards the left side of the room. Okay, and so on the contrary, when I'm on the other side twisting, same thing. I want to stack my right wrist right above my right shoulder so I have one straight line, spreading all 5 fingers here as I pull the arm up and rotate to the right. Now, this is an amazing variation to include. You can include it in every flow because it makes twisting a little bit more accessible for your students before you take them into a more advanced twist, such as the twist I showed you a moment ago, where this version takes a lot more strength and stability because both of my hands are lifted. As soon as I bring one palm down and rotate, now I have another point of contact with the floor, which creates a stronger foundation to twist from. If I'm rotating from this position, often you'll find students are a little bit wobbly, and so you might need to guide them to bring the back knee down, or bring them into this variation that I'm showing you now, where one palm comes down and you can twist and rotate from here. Because you're still getting the benefits of that twist and rotation, however, it's a little bit more accessible. Okay, and so include that variation as often as you can. Now here is a variation of high lunge where we are adding side flexion, so bending of the spine, And this is a variation you'll recognize from low lunge, because we can also apply this variation to high lunge as well. And so if the right foot's forward and the left foot's back, from here, have students reach the opposite arm up to whichever leg is facing forward. So in this case, my right foot's forward, so my left arm is lifted. My right hand comes to my right hip. It's important to have students inhale first to lift not only the arm up, but also the breastbone. So you're finding length in the spine as you reach that left arm overhead towards the ceiling. Now on the exhale, I'll take this into a side bend. And so I'm starting to lean my torso over to the right as I reach my left arm to the right as well. Now you can also have students keep the chin lifted, so you're looking up towards the palm, and that ensures that the neck maintains length as well as you're coming into that side bend. It's really important that as you're side bending, you want to try to keep the hips squared to the front. So essentially the hips aren't moving, you're only moving the torso and the arm. Okay, now on the contrary, forward and my right foot's back, ensuring that my feet are as wide as my hips. In this case, the opposite arm lifts, so it will be my right arm, seeing as my left foot is forward. My left hand places onto my left hip. I'm going to make sure my hips are squared to the front of the mat first, as well as leveled to the floor. And now from here, inhale, lift through the breastbone as you look up and pull the right arm as high as you can. So essentially you're creating a nice stretch down the entire right side body. Now that I have as much length as possible, I'll come into the side bend over to the left. I want to try to keep my chest lifted, my chin lifted, so the spine stays long as you're bending and reaching over to the left. Okay, you want to also avoid that the arm doesn't pull forward. Try to keep the bicep beside the ear as best you can as you're reaching over towards the left. Okay, and so the two most important things to remember are keeping the hips squared when you're side bending and to keep the spine long when you're side bending. Avoid rounding the back. Think of creating length before you come into side flexion. All right, and so this is a great variation to create a nice stretch down the ribs and in between the intercostal, or in between the ribs, getting into those intercostal muscles. And not only are you stretching the ribs, but you're also lengthening the diaphragm here. And so in order to support those actions, think of corseting the ribs in towards the spine. Think of pulling belly button in and up as you're side bending so that the core stays strong, the spine stays long, and then coming into the side bend. All right? And also make sure you do this on both sides so that you get the stretch on both sides as well. And include this variation of high lunge whenever you want that nice stretch down the sides of the ribs and the side of your entire torso. Now let's go over a few variations of a high lunge that you'll also recognize from the low lunge position, because all of these arm positions we also can apply to the low lunge. Now there are a couple subtle differences in how you apply these variations, and so let's just go over the proper alignment for each of these. Now, when students are in the high lunge position, you can have them interlace the hands behind the back. You can also have them grab and reach for opposite elbows. Another option here is to come to reverse prayer, so both palms pressed together, and you're sliding the pinky fingers right in between the shoulder blades. Now, the last option here is having students interlace the hands behind the head, and all of these options are going to help students stretch and open not only the chest, but also the shoulders. So you're getting an added stretch in the chest and shoulders, as well as in between the shoulder blades. Now, here's the subtle difference. Once you have students choose the option that's accessible to them, so once again, either lace the hands behind the back, reach for opposite elbows, reverse prayer behind the back, or interlacing the hands behind the head, once you find whichever position you're working with, then you want to make sure that you apply this action, which is squeezing the shoulder blades towards one another to help open, expand, and broaden the front of the body. So the chest essentially opens up as the shoulder blades start to squeeze together. Now, you don't want to come into hyperextension here like you would in low lunge. So when we're in low lunge, you can also lean back as you apply these grips with the hands. Whereas in crescent lunge, keep the spine in a nice straight position. Avoid hyperextension. Just apply one of those hand positions to help open up the chest. And the most important part is that once you have the hand position, that the chest starts to open. Okay, so expanding through the collarbones as if you're stretching the collarbones away from the sternum. Squeezing those shoulder blades towards one another behind the back, okay? Making sure that you apply one of those hand positions, but more importantly, drawing the shoulder blades together so that you find that stretch across the chest and in the shoulders. Now, these next two variations of a high lunge position are great variations to challenge your students and to make them work a little bit harder to increase the benefits of strengthening not only the legs but also the arms whenever they are in a high lunge position. And so let's start with the exercise that helps students to challenge themselves even more in terms of strengthening the legs. So once you have students in their high lunge position, have them find the action of pressing the front foot down and away from them. So it's almost as if you're trying to push the front of your mat forward by plugging all four corners of that front foot into the mat and then pushing that front foot forward. Now, as you're doing that, you're finding the opposite action in the ball of the back foot. So it's essentially pushing the ball of the back foot down and also towards the back of the room, almost as if you're trying to lengthen the back of your mat even more towards the wall that's behind you. So front foot plugs down and pushes forward. The ball of the back foot plugs down and pushes back. So it's as if you're trying to stretch your mat in opposite direction. Front of the mat forward, back of the mat back. Now, if you're adding this challenge, it's really important to allow your students to keep their hands on their hips, just so that they can also maintain hips squared to the front of the mat. Because as you try to push your back foot back, often that right hip will pull back with the foot. Okay, and so have your students place their hands on their hips, point their fingers forward just so that they can steer the hips towards the front of the mat as they push the back foot back and the front foot down and forward. All right, this is a great way to really challenge your students. You'll notice that your thighs fire up as soon as you apply that action. Now, another challenge you can add requires a block. Once students have the block, you want to have them bring the block to this position so it's nice and wide, and both palms press firmly into the sides of the block. Now, when students are in their lunge position, they can find the alignment of biceps beside the ears, straightening through the elbows, but relaxing the shoulders. Now, as I start to push my palms into the block, I'm really challenging my biceps and my triceps. Both muscles are hugging in towards the arm bones. And so as the arms activate, by pushing the palms into the edges of the block, now I'm strengthening my arms even more, and also creating more stability and strength in the shoulders because they're also supporting that action. Okay, now it is important that as you're pushing palms into the edges of the block, that the shoulders stay relaxed away from the ears. So just watch that the shoulders don't lift. Keep the shoulders relaxed. Make sure that the effort is coming from the arms by pushing the palms into the edges of the block. Okay, you can also apply both of those challenges together. So pushing front foot down and forward as the ball of the back foot presses back, making sure hips stay squared, and pushing the palms into the block, because now you're really challenging your students to strengthen the arms and the legs. And so both of those variations are great for adding an extra challenge. Now let's talk about sequencing high lunge in a practice. High lunge is a position that can be placed pretty much any time throughout the standing series. However, there are a few things to consider when you are sequencing high lunge position. The first thing is that although a high lunge position can be incorporated in a sun salutation, just like our low lunge position, I would include a version of a sun salutation with a high lunge that comes after a version of a sun salutation with a low lunge. The reason being, low lunge helps prepare for high lunge. So if you are going to sequence it in a sun salutation, start with a couple warm-ups and include low lunge first before doing a variation of a sun salutation that includes high lunge. Now, another thing to consider about sequencing high lunge in a practice is you can include it as a posture that really helps to build strength and momentum and properly prepares the body for some of the more advanced standing postures. Because high lunge is pretty accessible. It's not one of the more challenging standing postures. And so use it in sequence so that it comes first before you get into some of the more challenging standing postures. All right, now the last thing to consider is high lunge is a great position to transition into some balancing postures that we'll get into in a moment. And it's also a great position to come into whenever you want to include twisting and rotation. In fact, one of the best twists and rotation comes from our high lunge position. Remembering this variation of a twisted lunge that I showed you earlier, this position is a pose that I really encourage you to include in every practice if you can. It's such a great twist, and so that's another thing to consider when sequencing high lunge, is use it as an opportunity to then add a twist. There are a few other things to consider when sequencing a high lunge position, which we will get into in a moment, but just know that high lunge should come after low lunge, and it's a great pose to help you to build strength and momentum that will help you with some of the more difficult standing postures. And so use it as an opportunity to warm up and prepare the body for some of the harder poses. Now let's talk about the most common way of sequencing high lunge, which is to transition from a downward facing dog into high lunge. And so anytime you're coming into a pose for the first time, you're going to want to give as much information as you need to so that students know how to align their bodies. So once you've gone through that the first time, the next time you bring them into the same pose, you don't need to say as much. Students already know the alignment, and so you can just say, inhale, come into a high lunge position. However, if this is the first time you're having them transition from downward dog into high lunge, here's how you would do that. So first, have students in downward facing dog. Remember, we always start with the right side, and so these are the cues you'll give to sequence high lunge from downward dog. Inhale, lift your right leg high. Exhale, step your right foot between your palms. Walk your foot forward if you need to, so your knee is above your ankle. Make sure your feet are as wide as your hips. Press your left heel towards the back wall. Inhale, lean back until your spine is upright, reaching your arms over your head. Crescent lunge position. Now that you have students in their crescent lunge position, you can take them into another pose or have them move through a vinyasa. Once students have moved through their vinyasa, as I'm doing right now, and they're all the way back in their downward facing dog, here's how you would take them into crescent lunge on the left side. Inhale, lift your left leg high. Exhale, step your left foot between your palms. Make sure your left knee is right above your left ankle and your feet are as wide as your hips. Inhale, lean back, reaching your arms overhead, crescent lunge position. Now, if I have taken students through both sides of their crescent lunge and I'm instructing a lunge for a second time, I don't need to say as much. And so if I'm taking them from downward dog into lunge position, after having already gone through all the important alignment cues, I can just say, inhale, lift your right leg high. Exhale, step your right foot between your hands. Inhale, rise into crescent lunge. And so that is how you have students transition into high lunge. First, have them lift whatever leg is going to step forward. Once they've stepped the foot through, if it's the first time teaching the lunge, make sure you touch on all the important alignment cues and then have them come up. And if it's the second time you're teaching a lunge position, once they've stepped their foot to the front of the mat, just say, inhale, rise. into crescent lunge. And so that is the most common way you're going to sequence a high lunge position, is from downward facing dog first. And remember all the cues you need to know in order to have students make that transition. Now let's go over a sequence that will help you take students from a high lunge position to the front of their mat for any balancing that you're going to do on one leg. And the reason why we use this transition is because the shape that you're in whenever you're in a high lunge position is the perfect shape to then transition from, so that you're balancing on one leg. All right, so starting in a high lunge, I'll have my left foot forward. And the first thing you want to have students do from their high lunge position is interlace their hands and extend and reach the arms forward. Now from here, I can transition to standing on my left leg while hugging my right knee in towards my chest. And so you'll notice the only thing I had to do to find that transition is simply step onto my left foot as I pull my right knee to my chest. This is why that transition is a good transition to use, is because the shape you're in here is suitable to then come to this position. Now that you have students in this position, you can work in poses like tree pose, or perhaps more challenging arm balances where you extend one leg at a time. And so remember that sequence of coming from high lunge into balancing on one foot at the front of the mat. The foot that you balance on is the foot that is forward. All right, and so if I'm on high lunge on the other side, I'll just make sure that I then transition here as well to the same position before repeating the exact same sequence that I did on the right side on the left side. All right, and so now that you know that sequence, let's go over the exact cues you're going to use to have students make that transition, starting in a high lunge position. Once students are here, these are the cues to give. Interlace your hands together, reach your arms towards the front of the room, balancing on your left leg, catch your right knee at the front of your mat. Now that you have students here, you can then work in whatever balancing pose that you'd like to include. I'll go over those cues a second time, demonstrating that sequence with my left foot forward. Once students are in high lunge, these are the cues to give. Interlace your hands together, reach and extend your arms forward, balancing on your left foot, catch your right knee at the front of your mat. Once students are here, then you'll take them into whatever balancing pose comes next. But remember that way of sequencing high lunge to standing on one leg at the front of the mat. Now, another thing to consider when sequencing your high lunge is that it's the perfect posture to transition into warrior three, as well as standing splits and revolved half moon. That's because the shape that we're in whenever we are in a crescent lunge position is a very similar shape to warrior three, for instance. All I need to do to enter warrior three is lean forward and lift my back leg. If you think about the position of my hips in a high lunge, they're already squared to the front of my mat, so that when I come into warrior three, now my hips are squared to the floor, which is also an important alignment piece. Similarly, whenever we're transitioning into standing splits from a high lunge, all I need to do is lean forward, grab a hold of my ankle with my left hand, my right hand comes to my mat, and then from here I just need to lift my back leg up. I already have my hips squared to the floor, which is the alignment I'm looking for. And so if you think about the shape you're in here, it's very simple to transition to warrior three, as well as into standing splits. Now, the third posture that is also a good pose to transition into from a high lunge is your revolved half moon. All I need to do is lean forward, placing one hand to the mat, my other hand to my hip, before lifting my back leg. And then from here, it's a simple lift of my left arm, which takes me into revolved half moon. And so all of those postures are easy to get into when you're in a high lunge position first. So remember those sequences and remember to use high lunge as a starting point before you enter poses like your standing splits, your warrior three, and your revolved half moon. Now let's finish with all of the postures that are closely connected to high lunge, starting with low lunge. Low lunge and high lunge are pretty much identical in terms of alignment. So if you can remember the alignment for low lunge, just apply it to high lunge with the following two exceptions. For low lunge, we bring the back knee down, whereas high lunge, we keep the back knee lifted. In low lunge, we also invite hyperextension and leaning back, whereas in a high lunge, we avoid leaning back and hyperextending the spine, and we keep the torso upright. Aside from that, if you can remember all the important alignment foundations for low lunge, just apply them to high lunge, and it makes things easy to remember. Now, another pose that is closely connected to high lunge is the variation of high lunge where we twist. Okay, the reason why I'm mentioning this now is because out of all the variations of a high lunge that I showed you, make sure that you incorporate that twist as often as you can. In fact, I would consider it a foundational posture to try to always include, and that's because it's such an effective stretch for students. And so those two poses, high lunge and revolved twist, when we're in high lunge, are also closely connected. Now, the last three poses that are also connected to a high lunge are all of the postures we transition into from a high lunge, which are high lunge into warrior three. And so warrior three is closely connected to our high lunge, as well as that transition from high lunge into standing splits. And so standing splits is closely connected to our high lunge. And last but not least, the transition from a high lunge into revolved half moon. And so because we transition from high lunge into those three postures, that is why they are also closely connected to a high lunge position. And so all of those poses are closely related to high lunge.